The night was quiet, except for the faint crackle of the lantern's flame. Its golden glow flickered against the rough-hewn logs of the small cabin, painting shadows that seemed to breathe with the silence. Outside, the world was hushed beneath a veil of autumn chill. But inside, three souls lingered on the edge of a question that had waited too long to be spoken. The little girl sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the man before her. He was strong, weathered by years of work and wandering, yet there was something vulnerable in the way he knelt down to meet her gaze. The woman across the room clasped her hands to her mouth, her breath caught, as if she too had been waiting for this moment and feared what might follow. The girl's voice came soft, hardly louder than the whisper of the wind beyond the shuttered windows. "Are you my father?" she asked, the words trembling like a leaf about to fall. She reached forward, her tiny fingers brushing his cheek. It was a simple touch, but in that moment it carried more weight than any words spoken in the churchyard or the marketplace. It was a touch that demanded truth. The man did not answer right away. He closed his eyes for just a second, as though the weight of the question pulled him into a past he had tried hard to forget. His shoulders stiffened, then softened. He looked at her again, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in his dark eyes, a memory, a sorrow, or maybe a long-buried promise. The woman on the bench gasped, as though she too saw it, and tears welled in her eyes. The air between them thickened, heavy with secrets. The village outside had no knowledge of what was unfolding within the cabin walls. To the neighbors, this was just another autumn evening in the year 1879. The harvest had been good, the barns full, and the men would soon gather in the square to trade stories and tobacco. Children ran through the dusty lanes until the dusk called them home. Lanterns glowed in windows, fires warmed the hearths, and the simple rhythm of life carried on as it always had. Yet here, in this cabin at the edge of town, life was about to turn in a way that no one could have predicted. The little girl's world had always been filled with questions. Her mother never spoke much of the past, only of survival, how to keep the fire burning through the night, how to mend worn clothes until they could last another winter, how to pray when the church bells tolled on Sundays. But whispers carried through the village, whispers she caught though she was too young to fully understand. They spoke of a man who once rode into town years before, a stranger who did not stay long but left behind a trail of stories. And in those whispers, the little girl sometimes caught the hint that she herself was part of that story. She carried the same eyes, the same boldness, though no one dared say it aloud in her presence. Tonight, she had gathered the courage to ask the question that haunted her dreams. The man before her had returned suddenly, without warning, like a ghost, stepping back into the world of the living. His arrival had stirred unease in the village. Some said he was trouble, others that he was searching for redemption. He had been seen helping a farmer lift a broken wagon from the mud, or lending his strength at the sawmill, yet always keeping to himself. Still, when the little girl first saw him by the well that morning, she felt something stir inside her, something that told her she had known him all along. She followed him with her eyes, and when he finally turned to meet her stare, it was as if the world had gone still. Now, as she sat before him in the dim cabin light, her small hand still resting gently against his cheek, she felt his breath catch. He seemed torn between two answers, the one that would protect her, innocence, and the one that would finally unveil the truth. His silence spoke louder than words, and though the question hung in the air, the child already felt the answer in her heart. She studied his face carefully, the sharp lines softened by the lamplight, the faint scar along his jaw that made her wonder where he had been, what he had endured. The woman on the bench could bear it no longer. "Don't," she whispered hoarsely, her voice breaking. But whether it was a plea for him to stay silent or a warning not to confess, even she seemed unsure. Her eyes darted from the child to the man and back again, as though afraid of what would be lost or gained by his next breath. Outside, the night deepened. The wind rattled the shutters, and the distant howl of a wolf echoed through the valley. It was the kind of sound that made people draw closer to their hearths, clutch their children, and pray for safety. But inside the cabin, the true danger was not in the wilderness. It was in the silence, in the question that demanded an answer, in the fragile hope that could shatter with a single word. The little girl leaned closer. "Please," she whispered again, almost pleading. Her hand lingered on his cheek, her eyes wide, shining with both fear and longing. She had no memory of a father's embrace, no recollection of a strong hand lifting her onto broad shoulders, no stories told at bedtime by a man's voice. Yet in this moment, she felt that all of it could be made real, if only he would speak. The man's lips parted, but no sound came. His throat worked as though choked by something far deeper than words. The woman shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks, her hands trembling as she pressed them together. The lantern sputtered, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance with the tension in the room. For a heartbeat, it felt as though time itself had paused, waiting for him to answer. But before he could speak, the wind slammed hard against the cabin door, making it shudder in its frame. The sound jolted them all. The moment shattered like glass underfoot. The girl pulled her hand back, startled, but her eyes never left his. The woman gasped, clutching her chest as though the very air had been knocked from her. The man rose slowly to his feet, his face a mask of turmoil, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He turned toward the door, as though the night itself had called him. The girl's question still hung in the air, unanswered, echoing louder than any storm outside. And in that silence, as the lantern's flames struggled against the draft, the truth remained just out of reach, waiting, demanding, and promising that the next moment would change everything. Would he claim her? Or would the past, with all its hidden sins and broken promises, steal the answer away before it could ever be spoken? The night was far from over. The door rattled again, the hinges groaning under the strain of the wind. The man stood still, his back to the girl, his shoulders broad and tense like a soldier waiting for the sound of a battle horn. The woman finally found her breath, rising slowly from the bench, her bare feet brushing against the rough floorboards. She wanted to reach for him, to stop him from leaving, but something held her back. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was the memory of how things had been when he first walked away all those years ago. The girl, too young to understand the weight of silence, clutched her knees to her chest. Her heart pounded in her small chest, her question still lingering unanswered. She wanted to cry out, to beg him not to go to the door, not to vanish back into the night like a shadow. But something in the way he carried himself kept her quiet. There was a strength about him that was both comforting and dangerous. She didn't know why, but she felt that if she pressed too hard, he might disappear altogether. The man finally lifted the latch. The door creaked open, letting in a rush of cold air that made the lantern flicker wildly. Beyond lay the dark edge of the forest, the whisper of pines swaying like restless spirits. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, gazing into the shadows as though searching for something or someone hidden there. The woman placed a trembling hand on the table, steadying herself. "Don't go," she whispered, barely louder than the wind. He didn't turn to face her. His voice was low, gravelly, carrying the weight of countless roads traveled and promises broken. "I'm not going anywhere. Not yet." The girl tilted her head. "Not yet." The words sank into her mind, filling her with both hope and dread. If he wasn't leaving, then perhaps he would answer her question. Perhaps he would stay long enough for her to learn the truth. But why did his voice sound as though he was already preparing himself to leave again? He shut the door with a firm hand and walked back toward the flickering lantern. His boots echoed softly on the wooden floor. The girl's eyes followed him, searching for clues in his face, in the lines carved deep by time. The woman, still pale, sank back onto the bench. Her hands clutched tightly together as though she were praying. The man crouched again before the girl. He reached for the lantern and adjusted its flame. Steadying the glow, "It's late," he said quietly. "Children should be sleeping by now." The girl didn't move. "Not until you tell me," she said, her voice steady, though her throat trembled. "Not until I know." He closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. For a moment the room was silent, except for the faint hiss of the flame. Then he stood, tall and unyielding, and turned his gaze toward the woman. "She deserves the truth." The woman shook her head violently, her hair falling loose across her shoulders. Not like this. Not tonight. But the girl's eyes had already widened. The truth. It was there, hovering just beyond her reach. She could almost taste it, like the first snowflake, on the tip of her tongue. She didn't know why the adults were so afraid of it, why their voices shook when hers did not. For her, the truth was not something to be feared. It was the missing piece of her own story. The man sat heavily on the bench opposite the woman. His hands, calloused and strong, folded together. He stared at the floor for a long time, the lantern light spilling across his face, softening the hardness that life had etched there. Finally he spoke. "This village was not always so quiet," he began, his voice distant, as though speaking to the walls more than to them. The girl listened intently. The woman closed her eyes. "Years ago," he continued, "when the land was still being claimed and cabins were still being raised with raw timber, men came here chasing opportunity. Some came with families, some alone. Some came honest. Others didn't." He paused, his gaze heavy. "And one man carried more secrets than the others." The girl's small fingers curled into her nightdress. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough to know he was speaking of himself. The woman turned away. Her lips pressed tightly as though sealing in words she would never allow to escape. The man leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "The past doesn't disappear. Not in a place like this. The land remembers. The people remember. And sometimes," he trailed off, glancing at the girl, "sometimes the children grow up asking questions that the grown folk aren't ready to answer." The girl's chest tightened. She wanted to scream the question again, to force him to speak the words she longed to hear. But something in his tone stopped her. It was not yet time. The woman suddenly rose to her feet. Her voice was sharp now, breaking the heaviness that hung in the room. "That's enough." The man's head lifted slowly. "You can't hide her from it forever. She's just a child." The woman snapped, her face flushed with a mix of fear and anger. "She deserves her childhood before the truth takes it from her." The girl flinched. She hated when grown-ups spoke about her as though she weren't in the room. She hated the way their words circled around her, never landing, never explaining. She looked at her mother, then at the man. And for the first time she realized something important. Both of them were afraid. The lantern burned lower, its glow now soft and thin. Outside, the forest groaned in the wind, and the faint sound of a horse's hooves carried through the valley. The man's head jerked toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. The woman froze, her face drained of color. The girl didn't understand why the sound of hooves should bring such tension. But she felt it in the air. The man rose again, moving to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. "They're coming," he muttered, almost to himself. "Who?" The girl asked quickly, her voice sharp with curiosity. He turned, his expression unreadable. "No one you need to know." "Not yet." The woman's hand shook as she reached for the girl, pulling her close. "Go to bed," she whispered, though her own voice was unsteady. "Go, and do as I say." The girl shook her head stubbornly. "Not until I know who he is." The man looked at her again, and for a brief moment his face softened in a way she had never seen before. It was almost fatherly, almost tender, but the look vanished as quickly as it came. He stepped away from the window, his shadow stretching long across the floor. The hooves drew closer, echoing in the still night. The man grabbed his coat from the peg near the door and pulled it across his shoulders. His movements were swift, practiced, as though he had done this many times before. The woman clutched the girl tighter, her eyes wide with dread. The girl pressed her face against her mother's dress, but her eyes never left him. She wanted to call out again, to ask her question one more time, but the sound of the horse outside silenced her. Whoever was coming carried answers to her, perhaps more questions. The man set his hand on the latch again, his face grim. He looked at them both one last time, his gaze lingering on the little girl. His lips parted as though he might finally speak the words she longed for. But before he could, the knock came a heavy, deliberate thud against the wooden door. The sound rattled through the cabin, louder than the wind, louder than the lantern's hiss, louder than the beating of her small heart. The man did not move at first. The woman held the girl so tightly she could barely breathe. The knock came again, sharper this time, demanding, and in that moment, the girl knew. Whatever truth had been hidden from her was about to come crashing into their lives. Whether he was her father or not, whether he stayed or left, the night was no longer their own. The man finally drew in a deep breath and unlatched the door. The lantern's flame bent wildly in the draft, shadows racing across the cabin walls. The door creaked open, revealing the dark figure standing beyond. The girl's eyes widened, her question still trembling on her lips, waiting for the answer that would either heal her heart or break it forever. The night was just beginning. The figure at the door stood tall against the night, his outline dark and heavy as though the shadows themselves clung to him. The man inside tightened his jaw, one hand still resting on the latch, his other hanging close to his side. The lantern's glow fell just enough to catch a glimpse of the stranger's face, half hidden beneath the brim of a worn hat, sharp eyes glinting with purpose. The girl's heart pounded as she tried to read what those eyes meant, but she was too young to know. All she knew was that danger had come knocking. The woman pulled the girl closer, her grip like iron. She whispered into the child's hair, her voice trembling, "Don't speak." Not a word. The girl nodded, though her mind burned with questions. Every muscle in her body told her that this moment was tied to the man's secret, tied to her unanswered question, tied to the reason her nights were filled with whispers instead of truths. The stranger stepped forward, boots scraping against the threshold. His voice was low but firm, carrying the weight of something final. "It's time." The man inside gave no reply. His stare was unflinching, his body still as stone. The girl saw his fist tighten, then loosen again, as if he were fighting two different battles at once, one against the stranger and another within himself. The woman's voice cracked through the silence. "You've no right to come here. Leave us be." But the stranger ignored her, his gaze fixed only on the man. "You knew this day would come," he said, his tone sharp as a blade. "You can't run from it anymore." The girl's small mind spun. What day? What had he been running from? She felt the heaviness of a truth that lived in grown-up words she could not yet understand. Yet her heart knew it was all connected to her question. The man she had whispered to, the one she had dared to touch with such hope, was he her father? Or was he something else entirely? The man finally stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him. The woman gasped, half rising as though to stop him, but froze when the stranger's shadow fell across the floor. The girl wanted to rush after him, but her mother's arms held her firm. They sat in silence, listening to the muffled exchange of voices outside. Through the wooden door, fragments reached them. "Past debts. Can't keep hiding. Child deserves to know." The girl pressed her ear to the wood, but her mother pulled her back sharply. "Stay away from it," she whispered fiercely. Yet her own eyes betrayed her, wide with fear, glistening with unspoken memories. The voices rose and fell, and then the sound of boots on hard earth faded into the night. The man did not return right away. The woman sat trembling, the girl nestled against her side, both waiting, both afraid of what silence might mean. When at last the latch lifted again, the man stepped inside. His face was harder now, as though carved deeper by shadows. He didn't look at them. He crossed the room and placed the lantern on the table, his hand lingering on its handle as if steadying himself. The girl could not bear it. What did he mean? She burst out, her voice shaking. "What day? What debt? Tell me." The woman tried to hush her, but the man raised his hand gently. He sank into the chair, staring into the lantern's flame. "Not all truths come when you call them," he said softly. "Some arrive when the time is right. And sometimes that time comes whether you're ready or not." The girl's eyes brimmed with tears. She didn't understand his riddles. She wanted only a simple answer, a single word that could fill the hole inside her. But he offered none. That night, the girl lay awake long after the lantern was snuffed. She could hear the faint murmur of her mother's voice, hushed and hurried, speaking with the man in the corner of the cabin. Their tones shifted between sharp and sorrowful, never rising loud enough for her to catch the whole of it. She caught pieces. Though words like danger, promise, blood, and return. Each word was a stone added to the growing weight in her chest. In the days that followed, whispers swept through the village. Men muttered about strangers riding through, asking questions. Women at the well lowered their voices when the girl and her mother passed by. Children too young to understand, but old enough to repeat what they heard at their own hearths, teased her in the lane with mocking words about fathers and secrets. The girl began to see the world differently. Every glance carried meaning, every silence carried a story. She watched the man work in the village, helping with wagons, chopping wood, speaking little. She noticed how the others watched him, some with distrust, some with pity, and a few with something close to respect. She noticed, too, how her mother's hands trembled whenever he was near, as though she wanted to reach for him but could not allow herself. At night the girl dreamed of answers. Sometimes the man stood tall, lifting her high above his shoulders, laughing with a warmth she had never known. Other nights he turned his back and disappeared into the woods, leaving her to chase him through the dark until she woke with tears on her cheeks. One evening, as the autumn sun sank low, the girl found herself wandering to the edge of the fields where the forest began. There she saw him alone, seated on a fallen log, staring into the trees as though waiting for something. She gathered her courage and stepped closer. "You never answered me," she said softly, her voice trembling but firm. "Are you my father?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers. For a long time he said nothing. Then, with a heaviness that pressed into her heart, he whispered, "I wish the answer were as simple as you want it to be." Her chest tightened. She wanted to shout, to demand clarity, but before she could, the sound of hooves broke the quiet again. Another rider, cloaked in dust, appeared on the path. He dismounted quickly, striding toward them with urgency. The man rose to his feet, his body tensing. The rider's voice was low but sharp. "They're searching house by house now. If you care for that child, you'll make your choice tonight." The girl's blood ran cold. Choice. Always choices. What did it mean? Why was she the center of them? She stared at the two men, her small fists clenched, her question louder in her heart than ever before. The man's gaze flickered toward her, then back to the rider. His voice was hard. "Then it seems the past is done waiting." The rider gave a grim nod, then turned his eyes toward the girl. For a moment she felt as though he saw right through her, as though he knew the answer she sought. But he said nothing more. He only mounted his horse and rode off into the dusk. The man knelt before her again, his face shadowed by the fading light. "No matter what happens," he said quietly, "you must remember blood is not the only thing that makes a family. Sometimes it is the choices we make and the ones we're forced to carry." The girl swallowed hard, her small body trembling. She didn't know if those words were meant to comfort her or to prepare her for something worse. But she knew one thing with certainty: the truth was close, and when it came, it would change everything. The night wind rose again, carrying with it the scent of smoke from the village hearths, the rustle of leaves, and the echo of hooves fading into the distance. The girl clutched her dress tightly, standing beside the man who might be her father, might be her stranger, might be both. The tension in the air was sharper now, heavy with secrets pressing closer. And though the night fell darker, the girl's question still glowed like a flame in her heart and answered, refusing to die. The knock that had shaken the cabin days before was only the beginning. Since that night, the village seemed to breathe differently. Conversations hushed when the man appeared. Eyes followed him longer than before. And the sound of horses in the distance no longer brought a sense of routine, but of warning. The little girl felt it too, even in the way her mother moved, checking the latch twice, keeping the shutters closed, praying longer at the table. There was a weight pressing down on every moment. Something was coming closer, and though no one said it plainly, the girl knew it had to do with him. And with the question she still carried unanswered in her heart, she would catch fragments of talk between her mother and the man when they thought she was asleep. Words like marshal papers and claim floated across the room in hushed tones. Other times they argued in sharp whispers that cracked like firewood, splitting her mother, begging him to leave before it was too late, and him insisting that leaving would only bring danger to their door faster. The girl lay in the dark, her eyes wide, clutching the quilt, wishing she could make sense of it all. By day, she wandered to the edges of the village where she could watch him from a distance. He worked as though he were trying to prove something to himself or to everyone else hauling wood, repairing fences, helping with wagons mired in mud. Yet always she saw how the men hesitated before thanking him, how the women gathered their children close when he passed. To them, he was not a neighbor. He was a reminder of something unsettled, something dangerous. One afternoon, while fetching water from the well, she overheard two older women talking. They lowered their voices, but she was close enough to catch pieces. "It's him, sure as the sun," one said. "He's the one from before." Rode off without a word. Left nothing but questions behind. The other shook her head. And now the child, poor thing, looks at him with those same eyes. She'll carry his shadow whether he stays or not. The girl's heart pounded. Same eyes. She pressed her lips together, not daring to ask what they meant. But deep inside, a fragile hope began to grow. That evening, as the sky bled orange and purple, she found him alone again at the edge of the forest. She gathered her courage, just as she had before. "Why won't you tell me?" she asked. Her voice shook, but she stood tall. "I need to know." He looked at her for a long time, then sighed. "There are men who'd rather see me gone, not just from this village, but from this world. If I tell you everything now, it puts you in their path." "I don't care," she said quickly, surprising even herself. "I just want the truth." His jaw tightened. "You should care. Because once you know, you can't unknow. And the ones chasing me? They'll see you as part of my story too." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. His words filled her with both fear and pride. If she was part of his story, maybe it meant she belonged to him after all. The following days blurred into a strange rhythm. The man came and went at odd hours, often watching the road as if expecting someone. The girl noticed her mother becoming more restless, glancing out the window, clutching her shawl tighter. The tension inside the cabin grew so thick that even the flicker of the lantern felt heavier, its shadows stretching farther along the walls. Then came the night when the sound of hooves thundered through the valley again. This time, not one horse, but many. The girl bolted upright in bed, her mother rushing to the window, her face pale. Outside, torches flickered against the darkness, voices carrying through the cold air. Men had come too many to be ignored. The man pulled on his coat, his movements calm but swift. "Stay inside," he ordered. His voice was steady, but the girl caught the edge of steel in it. "Whatever happens, do not open this door unless I call for you." Her mother grabbed his arm. "Don't do this. Don't face them." "If I don't," he said firmly, "they'll tear this cabin apart with you and the child inside. It's me they want. Let it be me." The girl's chest ached. She wanted to scream for him to stay, to finally answer her question, to promise he would come back. But the words stuck in her throat. Through the thin cracks in the shutter, she watched him step into the night. The torches cast his shadow long against the ground as the men surrounded him. Their voices were harsh, demanding. She couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough papers. Marshall, debt, name. Each word was another stone pressing down on her heart. Her mother pulled her back from the window, holding her close. "Don't look," she whispered. But the girl couldn't stop seeing him in her mind. Standing tall against the circle of men, alone but unbroken, the shouting outside grew louder, the air charged with threat. Then, suddenly silence. Heavy, crushing silence. The girl's small hands gripped her mother's dress. "What's happening?" she whispered. Her mother didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the door, her face stricken with fear. Then came a sound that froze them both, the crack of a rifle shot tearing through the night. The girl gasped, her heart leaping to her throat. The torches outside wavered as men shouted again, their voices colliding in chaos. Her mother's arms tightened around her. "Stay quiet," she whispered, though her own body trembled. The girl pressed her ear against her mother's chest, listening to the frantic beat of her heart, but her mind was filled only with the image of him. Was he still standing? Was he gone? Would she ever have her answer now? The minutes dragged like hours. Shouts rose, boots pounded against the earth, horses snorted and stamped. Another shot rang out, closer this time. The girl clutched her mother tighter, tears stinging her eyes, and then silence again. The door rattled, the latch quivering as though someone pressed against it. The girl held her breath. Her mother's hand hovered over the latch, frozen. A voice came through the wood, low and urgent. "Let me in." It was his voice. The girl's heart soared, but her mother hesitated, torn between relief and dread. What if it was a trick? What if danger waited just beyond? The man's voice came again, sharper now. "Open it." Quickly. Her mother flung the door wide. He stumbled inside, his coat torn, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. His eyes scanned the room, then landed on the girl. For a moment, everything else fell away. He knelt before her, gripping her shoulders with rough, steady hands. "No matter what you hear," he said fiercely, "no matter what happens, you must trust that I came back for you. Do you understand?" The girl nodded, though tears spilled down her cheeks. She wanted to ask her question one last time, to beg him not to leave again. But the pounding of boots outside silenced her. The cabin filled with the glow of torches through the cracks in the shutters. Voices shouted, demanding, calling his name. The man rose, his back straight, his fists clenched. The storm he had run from had finally caught up to him. The girl felt her heart hammering, her breath shallow. Everything she had longed for: truth, belonging, the chance to know stood balanced on the edge of the night, ready to tip one way or the other. The door shook again. Harder this time, and the men outside shouted for blood. The girl knew the climax of her story was here, just beyond the next breath. And still, the most important question of her life, "For you, my father?" remained unanswered, burning brighter than ever in the lantern's trembling flame. The pounding on the cabin door rattled the walls as if the whole structure might come down. The little girl pressed herself against her mother, her small hands gripping the fabric of her dress so tightly her knuckles turned white. The lantern's flame danced wildly, throwing shadows across the logs. Outside, men barked orders, their boots thudding against the ground, their voices filled with the kind of anger that could tear a life apart. The man stood in the middle of the room, broad and unshaken, though his chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. His coat was ragged, his shirt stained with dirt and blood from the skirmish outside, but his eyes burned steady. He turned once toward the girl, and in that look she saw something she had been waiting for all along. It wasn't just strength or fear or defiance. It was belonging. The door shook again under a heavy blow, and then a voice rang out, deep and commanding. "You can't hide in there forever. Come out and face what you've done." The man stepped closer to the door, his back straight, his fists tightening at his sides. "I've faced it every day since," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Then louder he called back, "This is between me and the law. Leave them out of it." His words made the girl's chest ache. He was speaking of her and her mother, shielding them even when the world outside demanded his head. Her mother clutched her close, her lips moving in a silent prayer. The men outside roared with protest, but the commanding voice cut through again. "Step outside and surrender, or we'll drag you out." The man turned, his eyes locking on the girl. He knelt quickly, grasping her hands in his rough palms. His voice was low, urgent, but filled with tenderness she had never heard from him before. "You asked me if I was your father," he whispered. "Yes, I am. I should have said it sooner. I should have been here from the beginning. But you deserve to know the truth now, before they take me away." Her heart leapt, a sob breaking in her throat. She had dreamed of those words, prayed for them, and now here they were. She wanted to cling to him, to never let him go, but the thunder of fists against the door reminded her that time was slipping away. He cupped her face, his thumbs brushing her tears. "Whatever happens next, remember, this you are mine, and I am yours. No one can take that away, not even the law." Her mother's tears flowed freely as she pulled them both into her arms. For a moment, the three of them clung together, the world outside forgotten. But the shouts grew louder, the torches flaring brighter through the shutters. The door was not going to hold much longer. The man stood again, squaring his shoulders. He looked back at them with a calmness that seemed impossible in the face of what was waiting. "Stay behind the table. Don't come out until it's over." Her mother reached for him desperately. "Don't go. They'll kill you." He paused, his hand brushing against hers, lingering just long enough to speak without words. Then he pulled free, walked to the door, and unlatched it. The night burst into the cabin with cold wind and firelight. The girl's eyes widened as men surged forward, rifles in hand, faces hard and unforgiving. They surrounded him instantly, grabbing his arms, shouting over each other. But he did not resist. He stood tall, his voice carrying above the chaos. "I'll come with you," he said, "but they are not to be touched. Swear it." The marshal pushed through the crowd, a grim-faced man with a star pinned to his chest. He studied the girl and her mother through the open door, then nodded once. "They're not the ones we came for." Relief swept through the child. But it was tangled with despair as she watched the men bind her father's wrists. She wanted to cry out, to run to him. But her mother's arms held her firm as they dragged him away into the night. He turned his head, his eyes finding hers one last time. The torchlight caught his face, and she saw him smile. A faint, weary smile, but filled with love. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile at her like that, and she knew she would carry it in her heart forever. The village watched as the riders took him away, their torches snaking down the road like a trail of fire. Some villagers whispered, others turned their eyes, but the girl saw none of them. She stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed against the wooden frame as if holding on to the moment. That night stretched long, filled with silence heavier than the howling wind. Her mother sat at the table, her face buried in her hands. The girl sat beside her, clutching the lantern, staring at the door as though he might walk back through it at any moment. Days passed. The whispers in the village grew louder, each person with their own version of the man's past. Some said he had been an outlaw, others that he had been wronged, still others that he had debts he could never pay. But to the girl, none of that mattered. She had heard the truth from his own lips. He was her father, and no one could rewrite that. Weeks later, word came from the town where the marshal had taken him. The trial was swift. Some said the evidence was heavy against him, others that the verdict had already been decided before he ever arrived. Her mother wept when she heard, but the girl sat still, holding her tears inside. She knew he had not run this time. He had stood, faced what waited, given her the truth before it was too late. Life in the village moved on, as life always does. The fields needed tending, the wells needed drawing, the winters needed surviving. But for the girl, everything had changed. When she walked through the dusty lanes, she no longer felt only the sting of questions. She carried answers now painful, heavy, but true. And with them, she carried his words, his touch, and that smile. In time, she grew strong. The memory of that night, of the torches, and the knocking, and his final vow, stayed with her. She learned that family was not built only from years lived together, but from the choices made in the moments that mattered most. She had seen him make that choice, and it had written itself deep into her story. Years later, when the girl had grown into a young woman, she would still walk to the edge of the forest where she had once asked him her question. She would sit on the fallen log, close her eyes, and hear his voice again. "Yes, I am." And though the world might remember him as many things, a stranger, a wanderer, a man with debt, she remembered him as her father. The cabin at the edge of the village grew quieter with time. But the story of that night lingered. It was whispered in the lanes, told around the fires, carried in the silence of those who had seen the torches burning. But the girl knew the truth better than anyone else. She had felt it in the way he looked at her, heard it in the way he spoke, and carried it in the way her own heart beat when she thought of him. And so, though his body was gone and the road had claimed him, his presence never left her. It lived in her courage, in her questions, and in the quiet strength she learned to carry, the story of a father and a daughter, of a truth whispered in the glow of a lantern, was not one the village would ever forget. But for the girl, it was not just a story. It was the piece of herself she had searched for, the missing part of her own name. And in the stillness of the night, when the wind swept through the trees and the shadows danced against the old cabin walls, she could almost hear it again, the question she had once whispered. And the answer that had changed everything. She was no longer the child waiting in silence. She was the daughter who had been answered, and that, she knew, was enough.